What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Just wanted to remind you guys to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you end up enjoying this video, and if you're enjoying the daily uploads. If we could get to 1,000 likes on all these regular videos, I think that's a pretty good spot to aim for. When you do these things, it really helps the channel to grow and ensure that I can keep making these videos daily for a long time to come. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories in these videos, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as one of my favorite parts about making these videos is hearing your guys' thoughts about the stories therein. Without further ado, I will let you guys enjoy the next hour or so of true scary stories, and I will see you guys again at the end of the video. There are times in my life where I've spent a lot of time out in the wilderness by myself. It was something I enjoyed a lot when I was younger, and that I can't really do much anymore now that I'm older. I do miss most of those days now, but there have been a few instances of things that weren't exactly pleasant. Now, I imagine you can think that I've come across my share of scary wild animals or scorpions or things like that. However, that is not what this story is about. This particular time, I was on a very long walk through the mountains. That was my preferred method of adventure. I was trying to see as much as I could of the outdoors while I was still able to. Because of that, I would very rarely ever go to the same place twice. This time was my first time ever going through the Appalachian mountains. The woods in those mountains could be very thick depending on where you were. I brought a tent with me just in case there was severe weather that would warrant it, but for the most part I just slept outside. Having done this many times before, I wasn't really scared of anything out there. I'd had some wild encounters with dangerous animals in the past too, but I'd never been injured. I showed the animals respect by keeping out of their way, and they also kept out of mine. There had never really been any problems. I hunted and fished for most of my food, so I didn't have food on me to attract animals to me. I didn't worry about things like bears. There were supposedly a lot of those in the Appalachian Mountains, but during this trip and all subsequent ones, I never came across one. I was heading south toward a specific area where I would rejoin civilization. It was pretty slow going, though. I stayed away from the actual hiking trails to keep away from people, too. One of the primary goals of these trips of mine was to try and keep away from people as much as possible and feel at one with nature. When you spend so much time out in the woods, you begin to get habituated to the normal sounds out there. Once you do, you become very aware of anything that sounds like it's out of the ordinary. It was about a week and a half after I'd wandered off into the mountains. I began to get a little bit nervous. I started hearing this occasional sound that seemed totally out of place for where I was. There were occasional things like the snapping of twigs that I hadn't been hearing before, but there was also the absence of noises at times as well. For example, the birds would just go silent, or the insects would stop chirping. I went to sleep one night and was woken by something in the middle of the night. I didn't really know what it was. Normally, the noises of the forest didn't wake me up at all. I went back to sleep eventually. However, I was woken up by something a couple more times that night. I tried to figure out what it was, but I couldn't. Eventually, I fell asleep for the final time and didn't wake up until the morning. The following day was pretty similar to that one actually. There was just something that seemed a little off and was bothering me throughout the entire day. I couldn't quite put my finger on it though, and it was really starting to bug me. I hated the idea of my little trip getting ruined, especially because whatever was happening was probably just in my head. I woke up the following morning after that, after having another night with multiple interruptions. There was just this constant notion of something off that was really bugging me. That night seemed like there would be a little rain, so I put up my tent for the night. It did end up raining a little bit, but not that much. The following morning, I felt pretty stiff, so I stayed laying down for a little longer than I normally would. When I finally climbed out of my tent, though, I noticed something that scared the hell out of me. There was a really old doll swinging by its neck from a noose on one of the trees right outside my tent. It was set up in a spot that I would be sure to see it the moment I stepped outside. And the thing is, it had not been there the night before. For the first time since everything began feeling off, I actually began to feel scared. I suspected that the reason I had been feeling this way was because I was getting the feeling I was being watched. Of course, now that feeling had been amplified. Someone had to have been watching me in order to set that up, and their message was pretty clear. I wasn't really sure what I could do about it, though. I had a general map of the area, and I decided to detour toward a road. It would take me a while to get there, but I figured that was the safest thing to do. Somebody was obviously hostile and did not want me in this area. It took me a full day to make it to the road, and the whole time I kept feeling that someone was watching me. I didn't even feel comfortable when I did make it back to the road. I don't know if I kept going the way I had been going, if I would have come across something I wasn't supposed to see. But for some reason, someone really didn't want me to go into that area, and I got their message loud and clear. When I was growing up, we lived in a rural home that was about an hour away from the elementary school we attended. We would catch the bus to school every morning, but the bus did not come down the gravel road that we lived on. We would have to get up early in the morning when it was still dark outside, and after getting ready for school, we would walk along the road until we came to the paved road. And that's where the bus would pick us up and take us to school. It was usually still very dark out when the bus would arrive, and we would watch the sun rise as the bus took us on our way. There weren't a whole lot of houses along that walk either, only one small one that had another student living in it. That was my friend Jeff, who had been my best friend throughout all my school years. He would meet us when we walked by his house and walk us all the way to the bus stop. There was an even older house, though, that we always walked by. It seemed to be abandoned. It was completely boarded up, and according to my parents, no one had lived in that house for quite a long time. We were forbidden to go and explore it because our parents said it was very old and could be dangerous. We used to go exploring in the woods around that house quite often, which I suppose is why they thought we might try exploring the property itself too. When I was around 11 years old, I remember I was walking to the bus stop with Jeff. As we were passing by that house, though, I noticed something very strange. It looked like there was a light peeking out through the second-story window. I could have sworn I also saw a figure in there, looking out through the curtain. The house was maybe 50 feet back from the road, so it was possible I wasn't seeing it correctly. Jeff claimed that he didn't see anyone himself, but I was pretty certain of what I'd seen. I don't know why it is, but the idea of someone living in an abandoned home was sort of frightening to me. I became very nervous as I would walk by that house, but really only in the mornings when it was dark outside. In the afternoon, walking home, all that fear would go away, and I never noticed anything strange. I thought that perhaps that morning had been my imagination. Maybe I was just overthinking. I tried my best to leave it at that. That was until one day when Jeff's cousin was riding the bus home with us and got off at our stop. He was going to be staying the weekend over at Jeff's house. Well, Jeff had told his cousin, who I can't really recall the name of, that I had thought there was someone inside, so his cousin thought we should check it out. If any of us were scared to do this, and I know I definitely was, No one said anything about it. The yard was very unkempt, and the driveway was there but had been overgrown quite a bit. The three of us walked right up into the house. We stopped not far from the entrance. It had 3 steps leading up to a very old porch. My eyes kept snapping up at the window, trying to see if I could find the figure I had seen, but I didn't see anyone there. Jeff and his cousin dared me to go up on the porch and knock on the door. There was nothing I wanted to do less, but I couldn't wuss out in front of these guys. I decided to just do it and get it over with. I took my time walking up, but I knew I shouldn't take too long. Finally, I knocked on the door. I heard a noise that startled me, and I ran back to my friends who were laughing at me. Jeff's cousin had thrown a rock at the house to scare me, and that was the noise I had heard. When all 3 of us looked back at the house, though, for one moment, I caught someone looking out the front window at us. We all only saw them for a moment before they quickly darted away out of sight. We were only 11, so we were pretty freaked out and ran away from the home. We still had quite vivid imaginations at that age. We thought that it might be a ghost or a crazy person living inside. If that wasn't scary enough, later that evening, Jeff came over to my home. I was surprised that he did, because it was so late and dark out. We often hung out after dark, but what he told me really surprised me. The old house was on fire, and he wanted me to come and see it. Well, my whole family went actually, and he was right. The house was burning down on the exact day we had all seen someone inside. This, of course, made us begin to wonder if whoever was in the home had something to hide, and they burnt the house down once they knew they had been discovered. I really don't know. As far as I know, there wasn't anything found in the house, as it was completely burned down to the very foundations. Whoever had been inside also fled, and we never found out who it was. When I first began driving, I was actually about 19 years old. I hadn't had an interest in driving before that, so I didn't do it until it became a necessity for me to do. In the beginning, I was really awful when it came to knowing where I was going. I would get lost a whole lot. My sense of direction is much better now, but it took quite a while before it got to be much better. My first really significant time getting lost was the scariest one of them all. I lived in the suburbs and had to take the freeway into the city for something. It sucked because I had never driven on the interstate before, and I was a bit scared. I did get to the city and get my errand taken care of, though. I was just as eager as can be to get back to the suburbs. I didn't realize, however, that I'd hopped onto the wrong interstate going home. They both started with the same number, so in my driving naivete at the time, I assumed I had taken the correct way. I was so focused on driving and the other cars around me that I didn't really notice right away that the surroundings were different than the ones I had been on before. I didn't know all the exits either, except the one I was looking for that was close to where I was living at the time. So I kept looking for it, but as I kept driving and driving, obviously that exit never showed up. I started to get a little bit worried. It wasn't until I had driven a whole hour and a half, though, that I really began to panic. I hadn't come across my exit yet, and I had no idea where it was. It wasn't until I came across a sign with an exit to a town I knew was over a 2-hour drive away from where I lived that I realized I had taken the wrong way. I wasn't sure what to do now. I knew I had driven out west and that I could go east in order to get back home, so I found an exit going east and decided to take that road and see how far it would get me. Sure, not exactly the greatest plan in the world, but this was long before we had mobile phones that told us which way to go. It was the only thing I could think of that would at least get me back in the area that would lead me back home. It's quite amazing how such rural areas can exist around and close to suburban and urban areas. The road I took first took me through a really small town. After I got through that town, it was even more rural. I was driving through cornfields which I had never seen before. I found driving that way much more comfortable though than I did driving on the interstate. As the drive went on, I began to get uncomfortable for some reason. I think it was because I felt so amazingly alone on this road. I hadn't come across a single other car, and the only lights I had to go off of were my headlights. I kept looking up into the rearview mirror. I was worried I couldn't see anything behind me due to the darkness. The whole experience was really unnerving. As I was driving, I noticed something a bit ahead of me. There was something sticking out of one of the cornfields. I tried to figure out what it was as I got closer and closer. It wasn't until I came right up upon it that I could finally make it out. There was a car sticking out of the cornfield front end first. I drove past it and slowed down. I began wondering how long that car might have been there. I thought about how there were barely any other vehicles on the road that night and began wondering if someone had crashed their vehicle. Someone else might not have come along to help them since this road was so empty. I began thinking about whether someone might be injured as well, and that worried me. I turned around and decided to go back. I wanted to try and help if they needed help. I drove past the car one more time going the other way, then turned around and pulled up on the side of the road. I had to get my car all the way off the road, and there was a ditch between that and the corn, so I couldn't have my headlights shining on the vehicle. I got my flashlight out of my trunk in order to see anything. My flashlight wasn't the greatest, but I was able to see enough to not trip or fall over anything. I awkwardly made it over the ditch and went to walk over by the car. I felt pretty nervous approaching the corn in the dark like that. It was so quiet and dark out there. It had a very ominous feeling about it. I was mostly hoping there would be no one inside. It definitely looked like this vehicle had crashed into the corn. There were tire tracks that ran through the ditch and then up to the car itself. Honestly, I half expected to see someone dead in the driver's seat or something. I got up to the vehicle and shined my light into the driver's window. To my relief, no one was inside. I looked around the rest of the car and didn't see anyone. I relaxed, thinking that whoever had wrecked this vehicle had at least walked away from it fine. Perhaps they had gotten a ride into town or something and would be coming back. I could just get back into my car and go on my way. "Hey, you!" I suddenly heard a voice scream out from the corn. It was so loud and sounded so freaky that I turned around and almost fell over. I had to grab the car for leverage so I wouldn't fall. "Get out of here! Don't touch my fucking car!" the voice said. I shined my flashlight into the corn, just in time to see a man hiding inside of it. He rushed over and slammed his hands down in the hood and repeated again what he said to me. I tried telling him I was sorry, but he began to come around the car. My fear got the best of me. I turned around and ran back to my vehicle. When I got into my car, I looked over and noticed the guy had opened his car door. He had something in his hand and was storming over to me. Before he could get over the ditch, though, I started my car back up and got into drive. The man had nearly made it to me before I was able to speed away from him. I looked back in my rearview mirror, seeing something shining in the red taillights behind me. Other than that, I couldn't make anything out. It took me a long time to calm down. I was so freaked out that I kept expecting the guy to pop out of my back seat and grab me. Yeah, I know that's supernatural horror movie nonsense, but I was pretty shaken up. It took me a while to calm down, and an even longer time before I was able to make it back to familiar territory. I don't know why that guy was hiding out in an abandoned cornfield, but he really scared the daylights out of me. This is my scariest experience of being back home by myself. It happened back when I was 12 years old, and it was a long time ago now. I still remember it really well, though. During that time, I lived with my parents, older sister, and younger brother. It was very rare that I would be at home by myself, but somehow it happened. It was a Friday evening, and my dad was out of town until the next morning for work. He didn't have to travel out of town a whole lot, but every now and then he did. I remember my sister was at her best friend's house and was going to be sleeping over there. As for my mom and brother, they were at some sort of a birthday party my brother had been invited to. I was not invited, and my mom went with my brother because she was basically helping the birthday kid's mom with the party. That left me home alone all by myself on a Friday night. My biggest plans were to relax and play video games. I was pretty excited about it myself. I rarely got to have the entire place all on my own. Our house was pretty average for the most part. There were 2 levels with all the bedrooms being upstairs. Downstairs was the living room, dining room, and kitchen. My mom left that afternoon, shortly after I got back from school. She gave me instructions on how to make a frozen pizza. I had never cooked before, but I loved frozen pizza. At about 7 p.m. or so, I cooked it and everything went pretty well. I went into the living room and sat in an office chair right in front of the TV. I started playing my PlayStation. This went on for several hours. At about 9 o'clock at night, though, I suddenly heard the sound of somebody stepping onto the front step where our door was. The living room was at the front of the house, so it really wasn't that far away. When I heard the person walk onto the front step, I assumed it was my mom and brother returning from the birthday party. I kept playing, expecting to hear the door open at any point, but after several minutes gone by, nothing happened. Nobody entered, and I got curious. I got up and walked over to the front door to look outside. When I did, I didn't see anybody there. There was no one at the front door, and my mom's car was not in the driveway either. As I was looking, though, something caught my eye off to the left. I saw what appeared to be a man walking through the front yard, just barely in my line of sight. He disappeared past where I could see, towards the side of the house, or maybe the neighbor's yard. I couldn't really be sure. I was a little bit nervous after seeing this, but I assumed the man had left. I didn't know who he was or what he was doing. I kept watching the front yard for a minute or two and saw no more further movement. After that, I returned to my video games, but I couldn't help being creeped out by what I had seen. I was trying to take my mind off of it, and after about 10 minutes, it was finally starting to work. That is, until I suddenly heard another sound, the sound of someone trying to open the back door of our home. Our back door was connected to the kitchen and went out to the patio. This sound was much louder. I instantly stood up and ran over to the phone. I called my mom's number. During that time, I didn't hear any more noises. I told my mom that somebody was trying to get in through the back door, and she told me to call the police. She also told me she would be home as soon as she could, but the birthday party was still going on. After that, I ran upstairs to my bedroom. Once I was in there, I called the police and told them that I thought somebody was trying to break in. After giving them my address, I went and hid behind my bed. I covered myself with tons of blankets. I was really too scared to want to know what was going on. As I waited for the police to arrive, all I could do was hope the man had already left and not tried breaking in any further. I wasn't hearing anything, but then again, I was covered by a pile of blankets. It felt like forever, but maybe 10 minutes later, the police arrived. I remember I got a call on the phone and was told they were there. I never would have gone down otherwise. I got up, but I could hear people talking, so I stayed in my bedroom. I remember a while later there was a knock at my bedroom door. I was terrified until I heard a voice on the other side, saying it was the police. I answered the door, and there was an officer there. He told me they'd actually caught the man who had broken in and been hiding inside. I was told the police got there right in the nick of time. The man had got the back door to the house open and had just entered and started hiding when the police arrived. The man was arrested and luckily didn't get far. I was honestly shocked when I heard that, but luckily everything turned out fine. He wasn't able to steal anything or do anything to me. Damage to the back door needed a little bit of fixing, but that wasn't the hugest deal. After that, though, I didn't want to stay home by myself for a while. A couple years back, my wife and I threw a Halloween party for our kids and a few of their friends. The deal was we'd entertain the kids until around 8 o'clock that evening. Then they'd head off to their respective houses to finish their nights off with Halloween sleepovers. In turn, that allowed my wife and I to throw a grown-up Halloween party. It had been both of our favorite holidays growing up, and since we'd promised to spend the holidays with my wife's side of the family, we threw the All Hallows Eve bash to spend some time with mine. It was definitely a family affair, just not quite wholesome enough to warrant having the kids in the house. Anyway, the party was fantastic. Everyone was having a great time, and my parents had agreed to spend the night in our spare rooms so they wouldn't have to worry about driving or getting a cab home. That meant my father and I ended up huddled up around the fire pit. It was around 1 in the morning. I was finishing off any beer we could find while making each other laugh and telling each other stories. At some point, I asked my dad if he knew any spooky campfire stories. I wasn't seriously asking him. It was more that I'd asked him half-jokingly because it was technically still Halloween night. As it turned out, he did have one to tell me. A creepy story he'd kept secret from me for almost 35 years. You see, my dad grew up in a small town in Ohio. He eventually moved back to Cincinnati, where he met my mom and had us kids. For college, my dad went to UC Irvine, which is out of California, about 30 miles south of LA. He said that he did love it out there, but he knew he wanted to come home at some point. He reminisced that his days as a beach bum are some of the most treasured memories of his youth. I knew that, of course, but what I didn't know was that apparently my dad had dated some smoking hot windsurfer chick that he'd met on Newport Beach. During the summer of 1982, his buddies and he headed down to the beach to throw a ball around. They saw this sign advertising windsurfing lessons, and the two instructors were a tall, wiry guy and this absolute fox with a mess of golden blonde hair. My dad said that he and his buddies found a spot for their stuff and started to throw the football around. All Dad did was walk off toward the windsurfing instructors, though, and talk his way into getting a lesson from old Blondie. My dad hated windsurfing, but thought it was a great way to get close to the instructor. Once he was satisfied there was mutual attraction, he asked her out and they started dating. She seemed like a wonderful girl at first, but after a month of seeing each other, he realized there was some weird stuff going on. There was a strange love triangle with her roommate and some professional surfer she'd met on a trip to Hawaii. My dad explained that he trusted the roommate was just a roommate, but over time it became obvious they were romantically involved. He didn't mind her dating other guys, they weren't official or anything like that, but what he did mind was her duplicity in trying to lie to him. She hadn't been honest with him from the get-go, and as they say these days, that's a big red flag. They stopped seeing each other, and eventually my dad moved back to Cincinnati. He started what became our family. Now cut to 1994. I was 6, my little brother was 3, and for my dad, the memory of Blondie and her weird love triangle was a distant memory. One day he opened up a newspaper, and there she was. He didn't recognize her at first. to the point he thought the name was just a coincidence, but there was no coincidence at all. The woman in the newspaper was the very same one he dated while in California. Her name was Dana Sue Gray. For those of you unfamiliar, she murdered many people in early 1994 and used their credit cards to go on a shopping spree. Once she realized there was a big manhunt for her, she cut off all her hair and dyed it black. And the cops still caught up with her in the end, and she was sent to prison for multiple murders. Dad said it was obviously very shocking. My dad said the thing that creeped him out the most was that he actually wasn't all that surprised. Sure, he was shocked that she had murdered many people, but it seemed in character to him, especially toward the end of the relationship. It became obvious to him that she simply didn't think rules should apply to her. Seemed to have this idea that she could do whatever she wanted and get away with it, maybe on account of her good looks. My dad said it was very scary, thinking that a minor and irritating personality disorder had grown and grown until one day she thought she could murder people and go on shopping trips with their credit cards, and the law would never catch up to her. It makes me think that psychological stuff like that is almost like a sort of cancer. You have to deal with it when it's small and manageable, or you let it grow and spread until it's far late to ever recover. What used to be a single flaw has taken over a person completely. So full disclosure, this story is true, but you're probably not going to believe a word of it. You'll likely dismiss it as a complete fabrication and go on with your life. Honestly, I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't experienced it firsthand. There isn't much I can do, though, to convince anyone this isn't something out of a Stephen King novel. There seems to be a trend to these sorts of unbelievable experiences. They always seem to happen when you're all alone, and almost always at night. These are the exact circumstances of my particular experience. By the way, I'm a journalist, and writing is what I do for a living. Because of that, my wording can be quite strange. I'll try to remain as grounded and concise as I possibly can, though. I don't expect you to just believe my story, but I ask you to at least listen and consider if it may be real. It was fall of 2006 in my hometown of Austin, Texas. I was a senior in high school back then and found myself in the unfortunate position of having to walk to and from school every day. The transmission on my Chevy Malibu went bad, and I was saving up to buy a new car before I started college, which was roughly a year away or so. One morning, during a homeroom, the entire school was called into the gymnasium for an important announcement. Once everyone was settled down, our principal, Mr. Keller, approached the podium and gave some rather unpleasant news. Over the screechy PA system, he informed us that one of our classmates, a young freshman named Stephanie, had died in a hit-and-run the day before. I had vaguely recalled hearing something about that on the radio, but I didn't know all the details until then. It was definitely a tragedy and very alarming. I didn't know the girl personally, but I couldn't help but bring myself to think of some unhinged guy just riding around town, not a care in the world after running a young girl over. They couldn't tell whether it was an accident or on purpose either. I felt I was at risk of being a potential target. I was one of the only seniors to walk home when school let out. I couldn't ask any of my friends for a ride because most of them either took the bus home or had jobs they had to be at after school. My place was about a 20-minute walk away from the school, so not too bad, but the route I took led me down some rather obscure back roads that someone could easily get lost on. I tried to brush off the idea that someone had deliberately killed this girl. I mean, Austin did have its fair share of drunk drivers, and it was also possible that it was just an irresponsible person looking at a cell phone or something at the time. I hoped the police would apprehend whoever took her life away at such a young age. 1 week later, the school held a memorial for Stephanie, and the police continued their investigation. The community had pretty much moved on, though. It was a Friday, and me and a friend of mine, Mike, decided to ride over to his house after school and get his older brother Roger to buy us some alcohol. We all sat on the back porch and shot the shit for a while. We played some darts, and before I knew it, it was already midnight. I had some work-related stuff to do the next day, and didn't really want to crash at Mike's place. It would be more convenient for me to go home. Mike was passed out on the back porch, and I told his brother that my dad was coming to pick me up. That was a lie, of course. I didn't want to inconvenience Roger by asking him to give me a ride home, and to be honest, I don't think he was in any condition to drive anywhere either. I had been drinking myself, but I wasn't dead drunk or anything. My house was only a 15-minute walk away from Mike's place, so I drew a mustache on Mike's face with a black marker and said my goodbyes to Roger. I set off on foot and eventually got to a dark, narrow back street that connected my neighborhood to Mike's. This stretch of road went on for about a half mile, but once you got to the end, my house was just around the corner. This road was completely dark at night. There were some dimly lit old-fashioned lamp posts that lined the sidewalk, but most of them didn't even work, and the ones that did provided very little light at all. This was a road I usually didn't take on my walks home from school, and rarely ever walked the streets of Austin in the dead of night. Under the circumstances, I was feeling a bit on edge. I got about halfway down the road when one of the light posts went out. Great, I muttered to myself, as a sense of unease began to grow. I stood still to allow my eyes to adjust for a moment. It must have been a new moon out that night, because I don't recall there being very much moonlight in the sky. After I eventually continued to make my way down the dark road, the tree formation to my right opened up, and I could see some floodlights in the far distance. That did brighten up things to see where I was going. After another minute or two, though, I heard something that made my blood literally turn to ice. It was the sound of a car's engine roaring to life, followed by a loud rattling noise. It's the kind of sound that's commonplace at vintage car shows, but when you're alone on a dark, isolated road in the middle of the night, that sound is terrifying. I remembered what happened to Stephanie just a week prior and began to scan my surroundings, looking for whatever was producing this noise. I didn't even consider that I may have been overreacting. There were no headlights in sight, though, and the sound was coming from somewhere very close by. That meant that whoever had started up the car was on the same road that I was on, with their lights off for whatever reason. I reached a section of the road where the distant floodlights were blocked out by a large wall that led to the entrance of my neighborhood. The road also curved, which meant there was nothing but an empty black void ahead of me. As I approached, I was reasonably sure that that's where the rattling noise of that car was coming from. I dreaded the idea of having to walk towards this noise to get back to my home. I decided my best option was to wait and see what would happen. The rational part of my mind was trying to convince me this was just some random driver out for the night, or a prank of some kind, but the danger I felt in front of me said otherwise. I slowly walked over to the opposite side of the road, toward the lamppost. As soon as I got to the other side, the engine suddenly stopped. As I stared into the darkness, my heart began to beat faster, and I could sense some serious shit was about to go down. Suddenly, a pair of bright headlights came on, and this mysterious car shot out of the darkness and came driving right for me. The blinding light momentarily stunned me, and I only had seconds to act before the car rammed into me with the force of a freight train. I managed to get myself to leap back toward the open road, with the car missing me by mere inches. I collapsed onto the concrete as the sound of tires screeching rang out. I stood up and turned around to see if the car was going to attempt to finish the job. When I got to my feet, though, I saw that nothing was there. It was an empty street. Nothing at all. There was no way a car that had just missed me by mere inches could have vanished into thin air without so much as a fading headlight in the distance. In the moments that followed, I wasn't quite sure what to do with myself. After the panic and shock subsided, I decided the best course of action was to haul ass back to my home. I went through all of the possibilities. Perhaps I'd had more to drink than I thought and was almost hit by a passing car. But that doesn't really hold up. I've been completely shit-faced before, and I was well below my limit that night. The car's engine revving in the dark was also enough to chase away any buzz I was feeling in the moment. I just remember those headlights rushing toward me and seeing my life flash before my eyes right before jumping out of the way. This thing sounded like someone put a lot of work into the engine to make it sound like a real monster. I only saw a quick glimpse of what was behind the headlights, and I'm certain it was one of those classic muscle cars, maybe an old Camaro or something. I'm not quite sure, as I'm not really a super huge car person. What really baffles me, though, is that they seem to somehow disappear as I jumped out of their way. I hit the ground, heard the tires screeching, and then after I got up to see what happened, I couldn't find anyone at all. I kept what happened to myself. What was I going to tell everyone? That I'd almost been killed by a ghost car? To this day, I'm still not sure what to make of this. I sometimes entertain the possibility that it was some kind of freakish nightmare. But I know that's not true. It's worth noting that the local police never found the car that hit Stephanie either, and her death remains unsolved. Something extremely creepy happened to me about a month ago. For some brief background, I live by myself in a small house in a busy neighborhood. I've lived there for about a year now, and it's been going pretty well. I plan to move out into a bit of a larger house in a nicer neighborhood once I had more money saved up. I work an office job with pretty standard hours. Well, one day, after getting back home from work, I went to get my mail like usual, and I noticed an envelope in the mailbox that looked different from the others. I didn't know where it had come from, and there were no stamps on it of any kind. I was curious about what this could be, so I decided to open that one up first. I went inside and opened up the envelope, only to see some pictures inside. They appeared to be printed on a piece of paper, and not in very good quality either, like they hadn't been developed or anything. There were 5 different photos, and they were all of me. One was of me on the sidewalk. Every day when I went to work, I had to park in a lot that was a few blocks away, and then walk there on the side of the street. The city was usually pretty busy, so I hadn't noticed anyone paying any particular attention to me or anything. The other photos were all of me as well. Some were of me in the lot getting out of my car. The last one was me in my car at a stoplight. I was really creeped out by all of this, obviously. There was no words or writing or anything, just these photos of me. I didn't know what to make of it. Was somebody stalking me? The pictures were taken from a decent way away, and they appeared to be zoomed in quite a bit. I had no idea as to where they could have been taken from, or why this person was taking photos of me. I went to the police station that very same night. I told them the whole story, that I'd gotten these pictures in an envelope in the mail with no explanation. I talked with the police for a while, but at the end of the day, there wasn't a whole lot that could be done here. It wasn't like the person had threatened me or anything. There was no law against taking pictures in public. They told me to keep them posted, though, and try to see if I noticed anything else out of place. Over the next few days at work, I actually looked all around. Whenever I got out of my car, when I walked to and from the office, it could have been anyone though. There were so many buildings in the area, and so many possible hiding places. The only good news was that over the next few days, I didn't receive any more pictures. That changed about a week after the first batch, though. I got another envelope in my mailbox. This time, there were 5 more pictures, all of me once more. This time, though, they were all various shots of me getting out of my car when I got home from work, or going about my home. I was terrified. This person knew where I lived. I looked around outside, but didn't notice anyone on my street. It could get pretty busy in my neighborhood sometimes, so it would be easy to not be as noticeable. After that happened, I told the police again, but there still wasn't much they could do. After that happened, I didn't receive another envelope, which really surprised me. It's been about a month and everything's been fine. I don't know if I will get any more, or if this person has stopped doing all of this. It still really worries me though. I'm currently looking for another place to live, either an apartment or another house. I also found a different parking lot for work. I'm not sure if that had any impact on the person not taking pictures of me or what. I still wonder who they are and what they want from me. Something really weird happened to me last summer. I live all alone in a house that's somewhat out in the country. My house is on a busier road, but I have a large yard, so it doesn't really bother me that much. My house is a ways away from the proper road itself, and I have a very long driveway. In whole, my property is 7 acres. Next to my driveway, I have a mailbox, and some trees are planted along the road for privacy. There's a good amount of grass as well. One morning, I got up and went outside, when I noticed something strange immediately. Someone had parked their car in my front yard. I walked out to examine it and saw it was a car apparently for sale. They had parked their car right at the end of my yard, about 50 feet from the driveway. It was facing the road, so anybody driving by would see it. The car was what looked to be a red 2002 Dodge Neon. There was a price and a phone number to call as well. Apparently, somebody thought it was okay to just randomly park their car in my yard and try to sell it. This rubbed me the wrong way. I took out my phone and dialed the number on the sign. A man picked up, and I asked if he was the one selling that Neon. He said that he was, and I told him he'd parked it in my front yard. Then I told him I didn't want him parking there. I asked him to move it somewhere else on the road. The man claimed that his friend had said he knew me, and that I'd said it was perfectly alright. When I asked him the friend's name, he said John Newman. Well, I didn't know anybody named John Newman. I figured this guy was just making this up on the spot. I told him to just move the car as soon as possible. He said he would and then hung up on me. I didn't know who this guy was or why he decided to park his car on my place in particular, but for the rest of the day he did not come by or move it at all. I even checked outside before I went to bed that night. Still had not moved a single inch. I guessed I would simply call him the next day and ask him once more. Well, the next morning I got up and went outside. It was around 7 a.m., and I noticed the car was gone. I guessed he'd moved it sometime in the middle of the night. That was kinda weird, but I was happy it was off my property at least. I then noticed something else. My mailbox was broken. The guy must have run it over or something. It was completely split in half and lying on the ground. I guessed he probably did it out of spite. I called him again, and when he answered, I told him he'd run over my mailbox. Of course he denied it, and I chewed him out a bit. I told him he'd better come back and fix it, or else buy me a new one. Either that, or I was going to call the police. He didn't say anything, just hung up on me. After that, I thought about what I should do. I ended up just deciding to get a new mailbox myself. In my mind, it wasn't worth calling the cops over this. I was really mad, but at least he'd moved his car from my property. I figured that would be that, but it wasn't. That same night, I was at home by myself in the kitchen. It was around 9 or 10 p.m. when I heard a noise coming from out front. I went over to look. Even though I live off a busier street, it's usually quiet at this time of night, and I seldom hear things on my property anyway. I went to the front window and took a look, and saw a guy poking around near my car in the driveway. I went to the front door and opened it. I had a feeling this was the same guy, returning to do who knows what. When I opened up the door, I called out to the man, asking him what he was doing. He was wearing dark clothing, with the hood covering most of his face. He turned to me and faced me for a moment. He didn't say anything though. He just started walking in my direction. I didn't know what the man was capable of, so I closed my door and locked it. He walked all the way up and tried tugging it open. Then I watched him run off into the night. He went all the way down my driveway and seemingly back out to the street. I watched out the window for a while, but I didn't see him again. I went outside and checked around to be sure, but I still didn't see him. He'd left for good. After that night, nothing more suspicious happened, at least not so far. I'm not really sure what this guy's whole deal was, or why he'd chosen my property for all this in particular, but I'm glad it seems to be over now. This happened a few hours ago during my night shift, and for some reason was so disturbing to me. I'm a police officer in a big city, so I've had to deal with some pretty awful sights and smells while doing this job, usually on a daily basis even. This, however, was something most unusual. There's a large homeless population in this city, with mental health and substance abuse being common issues amongst this population. It isn't uncommon to see a homeless person suffering from mental illness and acting very strangely at night. If they aren't hurting themselves or anyone else, that's fine with me. It was around 11 p.m. I'd stopped at a red light on a very quiet and dark street. I was the only car on the road. I looked over to my right, just observing the street, when I saw a skinny man in ragged clothing on the sidewalk. Their feet was planted on the ground, belly arched up to the sky, and their hands on the ground over their head. I thought to myself, that's quite strange. While holding this position, the person snapped their head toward me, then looked back toward the sky. They then proceeded to do that exorcist spider walk at me, at a speed which seemed like it was the only way they'd ever walked in their life. I immediately thought, what the fuck? It was just like a sight out of a horror movie. The light turned green, and I drove off before the man could actually reach me. I have no idea why that sight was so disturbing, but it really did bring back memories of like watching the Exorcist movie. This takes place in 1985, when I was 18 years old. My family, my parents, myself, and my 16-year-old sister Amani lived in a quiet neighborhood in Calgary. Everything in my eyes was perfect. Everything that is, except our neighbor David. I loathed David. He was 22 years old, and very cocky because he played electric guitar in some local rock band. He would always bring different women over, and from my sister's window she could hear everything. Whenever Amani and I walked home from school, a shirtless David would conveniently be there, doing bicep curls in his front yard. Every day he tried to find a way to interact with Amani. She would greet him back to be polite, but I always got a gross feeling about it. He would just stare at her until she entered the house. His eyes were so intense, and it was very predatory and off-putting. I'm now going to tell you what happened to my sister. It was a very hot Saturday night, and our parents were away for some reason. Amani was sleeping, but she was awoken by the sound of her window blinds twisting around. Amani immediately got up and turned on her lights, only to be met of the sight of David entering her room through the window. Amani was caught completely by surprise, which left her unable to speak. He told her not to scream and said he needed something from her. She began to tear up. She was convinced David was going to assault and kill her. He grabbed her face with his hand and began to wipe her tears. He bluntly told her he was going to marry her and took out a ring he said his mom had given him to give to a lucky girl one day. She tried to tell him no, but he, still holding her face, said they'd move to Mexico or South America and escape everything. She said no louder and tried to push him away from her. In response, he got extremely angry and hit her and told her if she refused again, he would kill her and me right now. She became so overwhelmed with fear she passed out. At that point, I heard a loud thump from my sister's room, which happened to be her hitting the ground. Immediately, I knew something was wrong, so I ran over. There David was, having picked her up and holding her in a bridal carry like a messed up groom. Judging by the intense smell in the room, he was dead drunk. I screamed at David, which startled him enough to let her go. He dropped Amani right there on the floor. He then jumped out the window, and I immediately called the police. David did not go to jail, but he had to attend mandatory anger management classes and was put under house arrest. Needless to say, my family moved shortly thereafter. This day, around 6 years ago, I had a scary road rage incident on my way back home. Back then, I worked 50 miles away from the town we lived in. My wife and I were in the process of saving money for our first house. We'd been living in a cheap 2-bedroom apartment with our young son Jacob. There weren't any good jobs in the town we lived in, so I was forced to look pretty far away for a good job. The job I did find paid very well, which made the long drive worth it. We only had one car, so my wife Connie would be stuck at home without transportation. Normally, this wouldn't be much of a problem. Most of her time was taking care of Jacob and doing stuff around the apartment. However, around lunchtime one morning, I got a very concerned call from her. Our son Jacob had been fussy most of the night. He was at that age, so neither of us had thought much about it at first, but as the morning passed, he'd acquired a nasty fever and was clearly in misery. Connie had called the doctor, and they were able to fit us in later that afternoon. That was when she called me and asked me to come home. I informed my boss of the situation and let him know I had to take the rest of the day off. He was very understanding. He gave me his blessing, considering Jacob was our first child. I lacked the experience and was probably a bit more nervous than I should have been. It was just a simple cold, it turned out, but you can never be too sure. These things can be much worse than you look. As you can imagine, I was pretty distracted on the drive back. Every 15 minutes, I'd call home to check in on Jacob's condition and make sure that Connie was doing okay as well. I was in one of these calls when I almost had a wreck with another driver. I was about 10 miles from home and needed to take the exit off the freeway. Like I said, I was distracted and didn't check my mirrors as well as I should have. I gave 2 quick glances and merged into the right lane. I didn't notice there was a car in my blind spot. All I heard was the long droning of their horn. Luckily, we managed to avoid crashing into each other. But the driver of that car was justifiably furious. I looked in my rearview mirror and gave him a meek little sorry gesture right before I exited. I didn't expect it to go beyond that point, but the driver had other ideas. I'd gone about a half mile down the access road when I noticed he was still following behind me. I could see him gritting his teeth and shaking his arms out the window. When he realized I'd seen him, he started yelling and becoming even more animated. Of course, I couldn't actually hear what he was saying, but he was obviously very livid. Things started to get serious when he began tailgating me and honking his horn. Every time I'd speed up to get away, he'd do the same. I was terrified he'd slam right into me if I slowed down even a little bit. Remember, the entire time this was going on, my wife was on the phone with me. She could hear him honking his horn and asked what the heck was happening. I tried to avoid worrying her, but when the crazy man pulled up alongside me on the wrong side of the road, I began to panic and told her to call the police. In spite of her repeated questioning, I eventually got her to agree and hang up on me. Now that I wasn't on the phone, I could fully pay attention to the road. I had no idea what this guy hoped to achieve if he got ahead of me or in front of me, but I knew it couldn't be good. Traffic around us seemed to be keeping their distance, except for one semi carrying gasoline. I don't think he had a clue as to what was happening. His large presence afforded me enough time to make a turn to my house without the man smashing into me. I thought I'd managed to shake him, but he caught up at the next intersection. Now I was just a few blocks from home. All I could think of was that I hoped the cops were there waiting for us. In retrospect, I shouldn't have led him to where I lived, but I was so panicking in the moment that home was the only place that seemed safe. When I made the turn onto the road outside the complex, my heart sunk. During daylight hours, the gates of the apartment were left open. He could easily follow me inside. My only hope was I could make it inside before he caught me. Like a gift from God, I noticed 2 police cars parked right next to the manager's office. I raced into the complex and pulled up between those cars. I watched as the crazed driver raced in behind me, then stopped for a moment before slamming reverse back out the open gate and speeding away in reverse. I fought back a great rush of tears. Laugh all you want, but my relief was immeasurable. Once I was able to compose myself, I talked to the officers and gave them the plate number of the car. I'm not sure if the cops ever actually contacted the man, but I hope that he was at least dissuaded from doing something like that again. Despite everything that just happened, Connie and I brought Jacob to the doctor for his appointment, and he was better within just a few days. For the next few weeks, I made sure to come and go at different times, just in case that nut was waiting for me. It ended up being all for nothing, but in our modern day, there's people out there willing to kill you over the smallest errors. Play it safe and keep your eyes and mind on the road. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.